Chrissy was just killing time, waiting for her next client, when she noticed a man sitting in the waiting room. His daughter was in session with her own therapist, and so he was just waiting around too. They started chatting, and pretty soon small talk turned into something else entirely. Their conversation was lively, fun, and deep. She was a Buddhist, and he was very into yoga. He'd even been reading up on Hinduism lately. They talked about religion, philosophy, and mindfulness, and she felt like she was talking to herself. Like this man was a reflection of her, an embodiment of all of the things that she loved most in the world. And it didn't hurt that he was very charming and quick to flatter, going on and on about what a great therapist she must be. There was an immediate spark between them, and she felt like she needed to know more. She needed this man in her life. There was only one little problem. He just happened to be the husband of one of her clients, a client she had been working with for almost a decade. She could have cut it off then and there. No need to be harsh about it. Neither of them had done anything wrong yet. Just politely withdraw to her office, maybe laugh it off as a strange coincidence, and figure out if she needed to mention this encounter to her client during their next session. But that is definitely not how she handled it. Instead, she soaked up every moment with him that she could, trying to ensure that he was as captivated and intrigued by her as she was by him. And when that hour finally ended and he left with his daughter, the therapist pulled out her phone and she texted a colleague. "Oh my God," she said, "I think I just met my soulmate." I'm Leah Denton, and this is Psychotherapy, a show dedicated to providing survivors of therapy harm a platform to share their stories and to offer language for those of us trying to make sense of our own experiences with the psycho in the therapist chair. My guest today is Rose, whose narrative of therapy harm is one of the most troubling cases of betrayal by a therapist that I've heard so far. Rose had sought out therapy because her life had taken a series of harmful turns. She was in an ongoing custody battle with her ex-husband, and it was just one court case after another. And she felt like she could never escape all of the awful messages he sent to her. She says it was like being constantly hounded by an enemy who was dead set on taking her children. Meanwhile, her kids had their own struggles, and trying to raise them and move forward with their lives amounted to a brutal and seemingly never-ending gauntlet. She began seeing someone at an area clinic, but it wasn't long before that therapist ended up leaving, and Rose was then assigned to a new therapist at the same clinic, Chrissy.
I started seeing Chrissy about 9-ish years ago. In the beginning, she was super warm. She was older than me, which my previous therapist was younger. And honestly, I made my previous therapist cry all the time talking about my ex. She handled it less than I did. So I finally was assigned to this person who was older, who had more life experience, who wasn't horrified. She was, but not horrified to the point of losing her own emotional regulation about what was going on in my life. She was Buddhist. She was big into meditation and mindfulness. She was really big on, acceptance. And all of those things seemed wonderful with everything that was going on. I really had no choice but to try and embody those things because a lot of things going on in my life were largely outside of my control. And so the only thing I could control was me. And she really did teach me that. And I'm not going to sit here and pretend that she didn't teach me anything, because she did help me with that in the beginning. And I loved how warm she was.
At the time, Rose had a diagnosis of PTSD and generalized anxiety. But soon after they started working together, Chrissy announced that those were wrong and instead applied the label of adjustment disorder. This is typically a short-term diagnosis that can apply to any number of different symptoms caused by recent stressors, recent being the key word. And it's the diagnosis that would remain with Rose for the rest of her 9 years working with Chrissy. Looking back, Rose can see that that's a very long time for someone to have a diagnosis of adjustment disorder. Typically, if symptoms don't fade after the disruptive events grow more distant, the diagnosis is updated or paired with one that allows for more specificity of symptoms and treatment plans, which, given everything that Rose had been through with her ex-husband, maybe those initial diagnoses of anxiety and PTSD shouldn't have been dismissed quite so quickly. Rose didn't know all of this at first, and why would she? It is 100% the practitioner's responsibility, not the patient's, to know that kind of thing, and to make sure that clinical record and treatment plans are regularly updated as symptoms evolve. But Chrissy showed no signs of second-guessing her first instinct. She seemed quite confident in her diagnostic capabilities, and who was Rose to question her? Besides, she really did feel like she was learning things in therapy, and she liked how close she felt to Chrissy.
I loved that she was willing to self-disclose because it made me feel comfortable. It made me feel okay being vulnerable. But I knew way too much about her kids and way too much about her personal life in hindsight. And after I had stabilized quite a bit, I started considering going to grad school to become a counselor myself. And she was super supportive. She listed all the reasons why I would be so good in the field and all the reasons why I should absolutely do that. That was probably 2018-ish. She started telling me, you really are more like a peer, not a patient. I'm super excited. I'm feeling really connected to this person. I'm like, oh my gosh, this person in this field that I'm interested in is telling me why I'd be perfect for it, is telling me why I should absolutely do it. And I hugely respected her at the time. I really looked up to her. As I got into the later stages of school, I didn't even have a bachelor's degree, so I had to do that first. So even as I got into the end of my bachelor's degree and starting my master's program, I felt she became sort of a mentor.
Grad school was a ton of work, and Rose had to take a job as a TA to cover her tuition. On top of all of that, she got her teaching license through an alternative program and started teaching while she was still in school herself. And she's proud of all of that hard work. And she spent those years soaking up information about the field of therapy. Information that made her start to question some of what she was experiencing with her own therapist.
I do have to say, looking back, now that I am a counselor, I realized that there was really not much therapeutic technique or intervention used. It was very much a room and a person I would go to, and I would vent about what was going on, and she would meditate with me for 5 minutes, maybe provide me with a little bit of that mindfulness sort of approach, but there wasn't much that was actually a technique. There wasn't much used that was actually a technique. So I still appreciated it. I do have this sort of policy in my life where I don't vent about my husband to my friends. I think that that's inappropriate. I think it leads to your friends not liking your partner. My husband and I both have that policy. And there's some things that I didn't want to get in an argument with him about. They're minor things, but they still drive me a little crazy. And so this was a place where I could go get all that out and feel better, not have a fight with my spouse about something minor, and not make my friends feel like my spouse is a horrible person. And so I really think I used it often for that, for a place to kind of get that stuff out without disrupting life in other areas.
Chrissy was a sounding board, a professional mentor, and maybe even something like a friend. Sure, she might have lacked rigor around therapeutic modalities and actual clinical work, but Rose still felt like she was learning from her, and she enjoyed how close they felt. No doubt, this was intentional on Chrissy's part. And that's what special treatment is for, to make the client feel bonded to the therapist so they won't consider leaving, even when they start seeing red flags. So when Chrissy left the clinic to start her own private practice, Rose decided to follow her. And it was good timing because things were starting to get very complicated at that clinic.
I started with her at this clinic. That got really, really messy after a couple of years because it was the same clinic where my daughter was attending, seeing a totally different person. And I had nothing to do with that. And my counselor had nothing to do with that as far as I knew. But my ex found out that I was going to the same clinic and made that a court issue. And it turned into a big mess at the clinic because someone there accidentally broke my confidentiality as a client there. He said he thought that I was trying to influence our daughters there. But the clinic directors got really nervous, which I don't blame them, because it was becoming a legal issue where someone there had messed up. And in the end, and I'm not sure if it was because of that, but it did happen pretty soon after, my counselor decided to leave that clinic and set up a private practice. And so I'm not sure if it was part of that fallout or if it just happened to be a coincidental timing. But she opened up a private practice and I followed her to her private practice because I felt really connected to her. She moved offices one more time. She kind of moved with the same group of people, even though they were all private practice. And it turned out that two of those people are now my supervisors because she recommended them to me.
Rose's daughter kept working with her own therapist back at the clinic, while Rose followed Chrissy to her new office. And things continued just as they had before. Some mindfulness and meditation, a little venting about whatever Rose needed to vent about, uncomfortable levels of therapist self-disclosure, and mentor-type discussions about whatever Rose was learning in grad school. The whole time, Chrissy made her feel so special. She was always telling Rose about how amazing she was. And wasn't it so exciting that they were going to be colleagues? But more and more, Rose started to have a nagging feeling like, this isn't really therapy anymore, is it?
Her child and my child ended up with the same diagnosis, and I had had it for a lot longer. And so she started asking me for advice on how to manage it and how to handle it and how to support her kid. And I was so happy to provide it, right? I was so excited. This person that I look up to is, hey, I actually need something from you. You can help me. And I felt like I was helpful because I had been dealing with it for years and I had an idea of how to approach it. And I had done a ton of research. Actually, most of my grad work was related to that diagnosis because it was important to me. And so I had research, I had knowledge, I had experience, and I was so delighted to be able to help her. But there was a point, and I think it was kind of in that internship year that I was doing, where I started to kind of look at that and go, I know some self-disclosure can be helpful, but I know a lot about this woman's life. I know a lot about what's going on in her world. And I would expect a little bit, an anecdote here and there. We're both moms, we're both dealing with teenagers, we both are going to the same fields. But I also was starting to kind of look at it. This is a little odd, and maybe I really should end this therapy. It's not really therapy. I know too much about her.
Maybe looking back, that's why the adjustment disorder diagnosis lasted so long. Not just because Chrissy was too proud to second guess her instincts, but because she couldn't bother with the actual work that comes with therapy, like updating case files and a diagnosis. You know, all that paperwork. What a pain.
I was realizing that this wasn't a super therapeutic relationship anymore. As I'm getting through my schooling and I'm getting close to the end and I'm doing my internship and all of that, I'm realizing this is not really therapeutic. This is a person that I just go vent to. There's nothing really diagnosable here anymore. There's nothing really specific we're working on. And I like having it, but I probably don't need to be doing this anymore. And so as I was about to graduate, where I would have moved into that first level licensure and needed a supervisor, and I was wondering if we could end this and then you would be willing to sign on as my supervisor. And I remember she looked at me and she goes, I think that would be an ethical violation. And I said, oh, okay, that's fine. Is there anyone you could recommend? Her telling me that the idea of supervising me would be an ethical violation has become really stuck in my head after her major ethical violation.
That's a pretty crucial moment. Unethical therapists often have no problem crossing boundaries, violating norms, and blurring lines. And this isn't something unique to Chrissy's story. In several of our episodes now, survivors have shared their confusion over how a therapist could be so rigid with some rules only to completely disregard them later on. It works as long as it happens on their terms, as long as they are the ones in control. Chrissy hadn't had the slightest issue with redefining the terms of their relationship whenever and however she wanted. But when Rose suggested a change that fell into an ethical gray area, Chrissy was suddenly all about keeping everything right and proper. And Rose does realize it would have been an ethical gray area. Moving from therapist to supervisor is probably a conflict of interest. It just seems funny looking back that after everything else that would happen, this is where Chrissy would decide to draw the line. Rose decided to meet with two of Chrissy's peers who also rented space in that office to see if either of them would supervise her. She knew Chrissy was close to them as both peers and colleagues, so Rose figured she might like them too. Neither of them had space to be her full-time supervisor, but they agreed to work as a team and take turns meeting with her. It had really started to feel like things were coming together for Rose. She had graduated and started adding clients on top of the ones she had as an intern. And now she was adding all of the supervision hours that she would need to gain licensure. She was still teaching, too. That school year, Rose was working part-time as a therapist while also racking up 30 hours a week in the classroom. She liked the direction her life was headed, but it was so much work sunup to sundown. Such a grueling workload would not be sustainable for long, and Rose hated having to spend that much time away from her home. Meanwhile, things were only getting more complicated with Chrissy and the web of intersecting lines all over that little office.
Around the time that this all was going on, my youngest daughter, my other daughter, actually started seeing one of the other counselors that was kind of in that group as well. Actually, the same office and same waiting room in just a different room. And I started to notice that my counselor was actually paying more attention to my family. All of a sudden, it was a lot of questions about how my daughter was doing and what my husband was doing about my daughter and how her marriage was and all this stuff. And she got really interested in hearing about my family to a degree that was different. A lot of little details that seemed to matter to her. It turned out I didn't know this at the time. It wasn't actually disclosed to me. And it should have been, but I didn't know that my counselor was actually supervising my daughter's counselor. It has to be disclosed who's supervising you and that you're being supervised. And I knew she was being supervised because I knew her license level. I didn't realize that my counselor was the supervisor.
I understand if this is all a little bit hard to follow, so I'm going to try breaking it down a little further. Rose's therapist and Rose's two supervisors all work in the same office. And now Rose's daughter is also coming to the same office for counseling. Her daughter is seeing one of Rose's supervisors, who in turn is supervised by Chrissy. Clear as mud, right? Rose definitely should have been informed about that dual relationship. But she doesn't blame her daughter's therapist. It seems like an honest oversight on the part of a younger clinician. Besides, that's what supervisors are for. Chrissy would have known about the duty to inform, and her decisions not to seem intentional and calculated. It's almost as if she was moving all of the chess pieces around the board, manipulating Rose and her family so she could mine them for data. She could survey all of those intersecting relationships and see what piqued her interest. But there was still one more person in Rose's life she hadn't met yet, and he would be the person to end up captivating Chrissy's attention.
I do remember kind of sitting in her office. Things are very friendly between us at this point. We laugh a lot. We're talking about our lives. We're talking about our families. And I remember telling her, like, oh my gosh, you would love my husband. You would get along so well with my husband. You guys have so much in common. And that's true. That's still true. Sadly, to this day, I can say that that is true. And she started saying things like, oh, well, maybe I'll meet him one time when he brings your daughter. Because I was working, my daughter went during the day. So my husband was the one taking her every other week. Oh, maybe I'll meet him. Maybe I'll run into him one of these days. Those kind of little comments. My husband took our daughter for her appointments. And when we both got home that evening, he's super excited to tell me about this really cool counselor he met. Oh my gosh, I met this counselor. You have to meet her. I think she could be a great mentor. She might even be able to take over your supervision. Like, she's amazing. I chatted with her for almost the whole hour that our daughter was in her appointment. She just came out in the waiting room and we were just talking, and he's describing her. And I'm like, that's my counselor.
So Chrissy meets Rose's husband, a man we'll call Scott, and she immediately texts her colleague and says, I think I just met my soulmate. Of course, Rose doesn't find that part out until much later. And when Rose texts Chrissy to say, hey, that's funny, you met my husband, Chrissy pretends she has no idea it was him. I can just imagine her scrambling in the moment and feigning ignorance to buy time while she figures out how she wants to play her hand. But her ploy is awfully transparent because it's unfathomable that she wouldn't know who he was. Scott even told her that they'd spent much of the conversation just talking about Rose. And here is Scott to talk about that first meeting.
It was my responsibility to take my youngest daughter to therapy every week. On the day that I met Chrissy, it was just like any other day at that therapy office. And this woman walked past. I had no idea who she was. She sat in the lobby with me for 45 minutes and we ended up talking. So we had this amazing conversation. It was incredible. She let me know that she's this experienced Buddhist. She's been a Buddhist for like 25 years. I've been studying Hinduism and yoga for a few years. In such a short period of time, we covered an enormous amount of ground. And I was completely enamored with this person. I've been taking my daughter to therapy for a significant amount of time. I've never seen this woman ever. And so the next week, she's there waiting for me. And that continued on for weeks. Every week when I brought my daughter in, she had somehow cleared an hour from her schedule so that we could sit down and talk. And over time, we started text messaging. And I was so excited to have this kind of friendship in my life. I was very open with my wife about the friendship, talking about her probably way too much. And so that's how things kind of started.
I very much appreciated the opportunity to speak to Scott. It's never easy for someone to openly discuss actions that they're ashamed of or regret, especially when those actions have caused deep harm to someone they love. Scott's perspective is helpful for corroborating and fleshing out the story Rose is sharing, and he offers some additional insights into the depth of Chrissy's manipulation. So I'm glad he was willing to speak with us. A little backstory about their relationship might be helpful here. They've known each other for about 25 years, ever since Rose was 15. Scott was actually the one who introduced her to her first husband. And when she got a divorce, he was there for her. They grew even closer as friends, then friends with benefits, and then, well, you know how the story goes.
When I got pregnant, I was terrified. I was still finalizing the divorce. I was not expecting that. And I told him I was pregnant, and he said, okay, let's go rent a house. And I was, we're doing what? And we decided to take it gently. We knew each other very well. We were very close as friends, but we weren't dating. We weren't planning to date. We weren't planning to be in a relationship, but we did move in together with my 2 toddlers and then one on the way. And we just kind of let our relationship grow naturally. We didn't really force it. There were no clear expectations at the beginning other than we're not going to be dating other people or sleeping with other people, right? Pretty basic though. There weren't rules about when you're supposed to be home and when you can be out and what other friends you can hang out with or anything like that, because we were basically roommates raising kids in the beginning. And it grew into what I thought was a really happy and really amazing marriage. It felt very secure. We adjusted our expectations over time of each other. We weren't originally planning to get married, but we did after a few years because it was what we wanted. It was an amazing relationship. And I felt like we were very, very happy. And I think we were. I don't want to say that we weren't very, very happy. I think we had a very, very happy 14 years.
Because of the unconventional, slow build of their relationship, they didn't start off with formal boundaries around spending time with other people. And Rose hadn't worried about it because it felt like they'd always been able to talk and be honest with each other when one of them was uncomfortable about something. But then Scott met Chrissy, and this was wildly different from anything they'd been through before. Parts of the initial meeting are actually kind of comical. Like I said earlier, judging from all of the available evidence, Chrissy likely knew who Scott was, but he had no idea who she was. And when he found out she was a counselor, he was excited to get her input. Hey, my wife is starting out as a counselor. I'm worried about her taking on all of that trauma from other people. And how do you avoid burnout? Things like that. Then, to make matters even more awkward, Scott started complaining about Chrissy to Chrissy. He said, I'm actually worried about my wife's therapy. It doesn't seem like it's helping her. She says it's not really therapeutic anymore. It feels more like they're just friends or colleagues. Fortunately for Chrissy, she was narcissistic enough not to take that too personally. At home later that night, Scott was raving about this amazing person he had met. And it didn't take long at all for Rose to put two and two together. That was my counselor, right?
And he's, oh, I had no idea. She didn't say that. And I'm looking at him and I'm like, did you introduce yourself? Because she knows your name. She knows our daughter goes to this other person. And he goes, oh yeah, just like I always do. And he does. He has this thing that he does with every person he meets. He steps forward, he leans forward, he puts his hand out and he says his full name every single time. And so I know he did. I know he introduced himself to her because that's what he would have done. So I texted her. And at the time, I'm thinking this is just really funny. Oh, how funny. My husband met my counselor. That's so cute. Whatever. So I text her and I'm like, oh, my husband says he's an idiot for not realizing who you are and he's sorry. And she texts me back and she goes, oh, that was your husband? I had no idea. And I'm sitting there thinking, really? You had no idea? How could you have had no idea? My last name is not common where I live. My husband's first name is sort of common, but I know he would have introduced himself with his full name. You've had me as a client for 9+ years. It didn't ring a bell? Because I would tell you it would ring a bell for me.
The next week, when Scott came in to drop off their daughter for her session, Chrissy was right there once again, and she seemed to be waiting for him. She said, I've got an hour to spare. Would you want to come in my office and have some coffee and chat? Scott thought maybe it would be like free therapy. If nothing else, the two of them made great conversation together, talking about theology, philosophy, the big picture of life, and everything and anything in between. Scott will be the first to admit his feelings for Chrissy weren't strictly platonic, not even from the beginning. Because here we should acknowledge that Scott is, by all accounts, a big flirt. He's bisexual, and he says he's attracted to just about everybody he meets. So he didn't see the red flags with Chrissy right away. Sure, he was attracted to her, but that didn't exactly make her unique. They were just killing time until his daughter was done. At least that's what he tried to tell himself. Since they both enjoyed those times so much, it makes sense that soon enough, their conversations would spill beyond that 1 hour a week. They started texting, mostly memes and jokes at first, nothing too serious. But neither of them bothered to tell Rose how often they were talking.
Then I had a break in my insurance coverage when I went to the coverage that the school was offering for that year. And so I didn't see her for 3 weeks, maybe a month. And during that time, all of a sudden, I do learn that she and my husband are texting constantly. She invites him to go do a couple of events with her, one of which was during a time that I was always working. And so I wasn't that bothered by that one. But one of them was late on Friday nights. And I felt really uncomfortable with that. That's when I'm home. We have such limited time together. I'd like us to be home together. But he was so excited to be doing these things. They were things that were right up his alley. And also, this was around the time that, again, I didn't realize, but he was abusing a drug that I wasn't aware. I wasn't aware that there was any use beyond what would have been normal for him to deal with some of his mental health issues, but he was heavily abusing it and I didn't realize.
Scott had experimented with psychedelic drugs before, but Rose wasn't really that worried about it in the past because it never seemed to get too extreme, and it was legal in their state. She was even intrigued about the potential benefits of psychedelics in therapy. So it took her a long time to realize just how bad things had gotten.
So I knew that he had started using ketamine. I knew that he had a lot of trauma. I knew he's also diagnosed with PTSD. And so I thought maybe this is something that will help him process some of that. And honestly, was actually trying to be to some degree supportive without being a therapist for my own husband. But what I didn't know is that he started using it all day, every day. And I would say he was quickly addicted. And I talked about all of this with Chrissy. I had talked about that even the use I thought was less, it really turns him into this kind of different person. He really dissociates from the person I know and he becomes very self-absorbed and he keeps saying he's a god. He keeps saying he's in this really euphoric state and I'm concerned.
Scott never tried to blame his drug use for everything that happened next. But Rose says it's clear it played a role, and he wasn't himself in those days. Just floating through life in a dissociated euphoria, his senses dulled to things he might otherwise notice. That also helps explain why Scott didn't worry too much about what was developing with Chrissy, why he was way too slow to notice major problems and wonder what it might all do to Rose. The drugs were dampening whatever instincts or sense of caution he might have normally felt. And on top of it all, Rose was already having a hard time connecting with him because she was running herself ragged with work, and they were rarely spending time together. Chrissy, on the other hand, knew all of this and was always available to him.
My wife was working very hard, and so would end up falling asleep incredibly early. I was, at the time, using copious amounts of ketamine. One of the effects of that is I was up all night. Chrissy was always awake, and she was always available to communicate with. And because it was this platonic relationship, it was, I have this friend that I can hang out with in the late evening.
Scott would stay up most of the night listening to music or playing video games. And no matter what time it was, late night or early morning, whether he texted first or Chrissy texted first, she was always there, always available. And the attention she offered him was exhilarating, even more so than the ketamine. She absolutely adored Scott, sometimes to a degree that seemed almost like worship. And to put it mildly, that felt amazing to Scott. He likes to be revered. At work, he's often the center of attention, placed in the position of needing to play hero, which leads people to singing his praises. And that can go to one's head very quickly. Scott says he knows he's prone to that kind of thing, and he likes when people put him on a pedestal. But one of the things that he appreciates about his marriage with Rose is that she doesn't do that. It could be hard sometimes after saving the day at work to come home and feel like, okay, Mr. Messiah, can you take out the trash now? But he knows that's how a healthy relationship should function. Instead of worshiping him, Rose sees him as he is, warts and all, and still chooses to love him. But that's not how it worked with Chrissy. She was constantly telling him how great he was, how perfect he was for her, and he ate it up.
I've really tried to frame this in a way where this was not a fault of my marriage or of my wife. I still believe that, and really convinced me that this is how I deserve to be treated. It's just not true. My wife and I have known each other for 25, 26 years. And when you truly know somebody, that admiration, that worship fades, and it should. And so it felt absolutely amazing to feel like I was getting the recognition that I believed that I deserved. And I have a very addictive personality. I love very hard. When I find things that I enjoy, I do them 110% until they hurt me severely and I quit them and I do them 0%.
Between the drugs, his innate flirtiness, and how much he loved her adoration, Scott mustered little resistance when Chrissy started escalating things. One night, late into another one of their long text exchanges, she sent him a different kind of message. It was essentially along the lines of, "Hey, I really need help having an orgasm. Can you help me?" It was jarring enough to give Scott a moment of pause, a moment of wonder if maybe this was too far over the line. But it wasn't a very long moment. He started typing out a story for her, an erotic story, and she told him it drove her wild. It was easier than Scott would like to admit, and he was able to spin up some quick self-justification. It's just a little bit of fantasy, just trying to help a friend out. His rationalization was convincing enough to soothe his conscience, but not so convincing that he could pretend his wife would be okay with it. From then on, he started deleting text messages to hide from her exactly what was happening.
I had never had to fend off somebody who wanted to step between my wife and I. I've never in my life had to fend off a woman who was attracted to me or wanted me in a sexual manner. It was amazing. I was absolutely worshipped. That's not something that was lacking in my marriage. That should never exist in a marriage.
Rose didn't know how much things were escalating between Scott and Chrissy, and she still wasn't aware of how bad his drug use had gotten. She was hoping this would all just naturally kind of run its course, because that's how Scott's addictive patterns had gone in the past. A steady buildup until things got too alarming, then cuts it out. So she decided to just be present and supportive without trying to interfere.
We're kind of coming into November of last year, and she's texting me. And now, after a few weeks, I'm becoming aware that they're texting more and more often. Every time he takes my daughter to therapy, she actually canceled her client that she normally had at that time so that he could come in her office and chat with her and they could hang out. And I'll be really honest, I'm kind of torn. I have this understanding, one, that my husband is very flirtatious, that my husband has friends of both genders. My husband is actually bisexual, so it doesn't really matter which gender he's hanging out with, right? It's kind of the same thing. But my husband has never cheated on me. And we've never had anything that crossed boundaries. We've always talked about things too. So if I'm feeling uncomfortable or he's feeling uncomfortable, we've always talked it out. And we've kind of set, okay, this is feeling a little weird. Well, okay, I'll cut back here. I'll make sure that it's kind of staying in this area that's okay. And so I did talk with him. I'm telling him, this is my counselor, and I'm feeling a little uncomfortable about how much you guys are talking. And he's, oh, don't worry, we never talk about you, which is already a different response than I would normally get when I say I'm uncomfortable. We must have had dozens of conversations about how uncomfortable I was getting. And he just keeps coming back to me going, I've never cheated on you. I never will. You don't need to worry. She's just a really good friend. She's basically the female version of me. And I love being able to talk to myself. It's kind of the way he was describing it. And I'm texting her a little bit. And I think, honestly, I was already feeling really weird about talking to her. Why are you friends with my husband?
In the last few months, Scott says that they have had to process these conversations often as they try to unravel all of the fallout of everything that happened. He would spin the truth and omit key details, assuring Rose that this was perfectly normal, that nothing inappropriate was happening. And he admits now that his behavior was very gaslighty. Like, I'm sorry if this is uncomfortable for you, but I deserve to have a friend, don't I? Of course, Rose had no idea about the erotica, about how they now had a shared Google Doc where they were typing out stories and ideas and confessions for each other. But the parts she did know were already concerning enough. If it was just that weekly hour during their daughter's session, that would be one thing. A little company to kill some time. But then there were all of those texts, and they started spending more and more time together elsewhere, at things like meditation groups and drumming circles. Chrissy even started going to the same yoga studio as them and shopping at the same grocery store. When Rose tried sharing how uncomfortable she was with all of this, Scott would dismiss her concerns, twist the truth with just the right amount of omission, and continue to gaslight her. Meanwhile, Chrissy's response was textbook manipulation.
Every time she communicated with me during this period, what she was telling me was, I really, really hope you're okay with this. I really, really just think your husband's an amazing person. I'm really, really enjoying being his friend. But you could tell me if you hate me, right? And here's where the kind of manipulative language comes in. If you hate me, just tell me. There's a wide range of things from I'm uncomfortable to I hate you, right? But I'm put in this position where I feel like I have to say, no, of course I don't hate you. And that's the language she was using every time we talked about it. You must hate me. Well, no, I don't hate you. Oh, well, so it's okay then. And again, I'm like, there's a big range of things. But remember, I'm working 50 plus hours a week right now. I'm in my very first year of really practicing as a counselor. I'm trying to get through the school year, which honestly was my most difficult year teaching ever. I had a really rough class that year. And so there's a lot going on for me. And I'm exhausted, literally just exhausted. I was falling asleep at 9 o'clock at night, every night, just crashing. And so I'm a little too checked out of what's going on, and I'm a little too easily influenced. So that language is happening, and I'm not really catching it.
It's worth pausing here to remember how this started. Chrissy is Rose's therapist. This woman who was commanding more and more of her husband's time and attention, sitting across from her and asking, "Are you okay with my relationship with Scott, or do you hate me?" is her therapist. Chrissy's behavior would have been harmful enough if she was a friend or a colleague, but it was compounded by the fact that she was ethically and contractually obligated to prioritize care for Rose. This should be a violation of every moral, ethical, and professional code imaginable. But by all indications, Chrissy did not and does not have a single shred of remorse. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there for this week. I really want to thank Rose and Scott for sharing their stories, and we'll continue with both of them in our next episode. Thank you so much for listening today. I hope you'll join us next time. A special thank you to the writer of this show, Bo Denton, and to our exceptional audio engineers at Peachtree Sound.